Do we need a set of armed forces that could fight Russia in a land war? Yes.
I don't want to be alarmist, and we need to be very careful and considered when we're talking about this. I hope that never in my lifetime will we see that.
But we have not prepared the British public for this at all, have we? Hello and welcome to the Political Forecast. This week, Rishi Sunak is ramping up defence spending as he warns that Russia's President Putin won't stop at the Polish border if he defeats Ukraine. The PM pledges to put the UK's arms industry on a war footing. Is that where we all need to be? Labour hasn't quite matched the pledge yet. To discuss this, I'm joined by our senior political correspondent, Paul McNamara, as well as the Conservative MP, James Heappey, who was Armed Forces Minister up until last month and is standing down at the next election, and Labour's Ruth Anderson, who quit Jeremy Corbyn's front bench in protest at his leadership, but is now in the House of Lords and is Labour's shadow defence minister. Paul, the language being used by the Prime Minister and the people around him is all of a sudden quite apocalyptic.
Yeah, that's a fair way of putting it. We're on a war footing, Chris.
Yeah. This is serious because, I've got a 16-year-old who comes home and says, Dad, are we going to be conscripted? Is my generation going to war?
I had similar questions from my 11-year-old who all he knows is Avenger movies. So being on a war footing is obviously quite terrifying. So we're now on this war footing. The Prime Minister's been in Poland and Germany. Like it or not, the world is now its most unsafe since the Cold War. Now, my 11-year-old doesn't know what the Cold War is, but he knows all those other words sound pretty scary. And the rest of us that are old enough to remember anything about the Cold War thinks that's all pretty scary. So we've already had this announcement that defence spending is going to go up to 2.5%. For people at home who don't know an awful lot about what the percentages mean, the spin that's been put up is £75 billion extra on defence between now and 2030. A lot of people saying there's quite a hefty amount of spin that's going on there. On the whole, though, this has gone down pretty well with Tory MPs. The ones that we've been speaking to, essentially any time they get to look a bit warry and cool, they're quite happy about it, especially when it's just before local elections, when they're not looking cool, but there is a bit warry, but that's just within the party.
Well, we have a warry and cool Tory in our studio.
Oh, exactly. So any cooler than this. And from the Labour Party, the line that keeps on coming up is, oh, wait a minute, he's making all these promises. He's not going to be there to deliver them should he not win the general election, which, of course, Labour MPs are hoping that he won't.
But this is all being framed in the context of Ukraine. And we've seen Rishi Sunak out there warning about Putin increasing British aid to Ukraine to about £3 billion for this year, which is obviously still a drop in the ocean compared to what the Americans are sending, but puts Britain sort of up there, just behind Germany, I guess, in terms of aid to Ukraine.
Yeah, and it means that we are still a major part of the conversation. Not only that we're, donating a lot of heavy munitions over that way now, which you'll know an awful lot more about than anyone else, but we are leading the conversation when it comes to Ukraine.
So I want to begin on this, James and Ruth. In terms of what is Britain's actual game plan strategy when it comes to Ukraine, because we've been in this now since 2022. We've had a lot of rhetorical support for Ukraine, some material support, but it seems to me that we give Ukraine enough to survive, but not enough to win. James, what is the actual strategy?
So I think the strategy is to get Ukraine to a place where they can end this on their terms. That's the kind of definition of Ukrainian sovereignty, that they decide how this ends. I push back a bit on the idea that they're being given enough to survive but not to win. The huge amount of armour that was provided for them that furnished a number of brand new Ukrainian brigades for their offensive last summer still exists. The challenge, Chris, is Russia has mobilized its economy and is generating huge amounts of military materiel for its army. That is giving it the advantage in terms of the artillery battle. And Russia is now on the offensive, although it is creeping forward very, very slowly indeed. Ukraine needs to be able to defend against that.
Is a military solution, if you like, for Ukraine just stopping Russia from winning?
No, because that's a stalemate. And if you consider the two alternative outcomes to a Ukrainian victory, You've either got full Ukrainian defeat, in which case the Russian army ends up on the border of NATO on the Romanian, Polish, Hungarian, Slovakian borders. That would bring with it 30 years of Cold War in Europe as NATO lines up on one side of that border, Russia on the other. Stalemate does the same. It just draws a line somewhere east of the Dnieper. And then you end up with a NATO force guaranteeing the rump of Ukraine's security on one side of that line and Russia on the other. So the only way that you avoid a Euro-Atlantic that is in a state of Cold War with very, very expensive military demands placed on all NATO members as a consequence is through Ukraine winning.
I mean, Ruth, do you think we've given enough quickly? Because a lot of people have sort of seen the Ukrainians constantly asking for more. For 2 years, we need more missiles, we need more tanks, we need jets. And it's still their demand. You're not giving us enough. So have we given them enough to meet the strategic goals?
Well, I think that they're on the front line and we're not. And so I can understand if that was us, we would be demanding everything yesterday as they are. Of course, that's what their rights are. But there are some things we would have done faster, and hindsight is a wonderful thing. But we talk about Ukraine from 22. Actually, when I was an MP, we were talking about what had happened in Crimea. And we didn't take that warning seriously. We didn't take the threat of Putin seriously. I wish that over the last, since 2014, there are things we could and should have put in place.
And politically, we've kind of adjusted as well, haven't we, to what we think we can do and not be at war with Russia. Sort of what we could actually send, what we could actually give them, and then not be accused of actually NATO being dragged in directly into this war has changed, hasn't it, since the beginning of the war?
I think it absolutely has. And after the illegal invasion in 22, I was with, in a slightly different way, but I was with some senior military personnel, and I was furious about, genuinely wanted to understand the detail of a no-fly zone and what we could and couldn't do, and air cover, which has always been an issue of controversy. And it was all about NATO and protection and how we were going to manage Russia and this relationship going forward, which is our priority, and protecting British national interests. And I understand that. So
what's the end point, James? I mean, is it that when they've got everything, they've got fast jets, they've got all the tanks they need, what do you think is the point at which you're trying to get to? To get them to win?
It's not to do with equipment. It's to do with their capacity to use it in a way that is overwhelming to the Russian force. That's the only way that you break through the line and successfully go on the offensive. There's no spreadsheet that says they need 1,000 tanks, they need 300 jets, they need 2,000 artillery pieces, and then they will win. That's just not the case.
If only that was the case.
They need British boots on the ground.
In Western Ukraine to do the training, yes. Macron was right in floating the idea, because the idea that you're going to rotate Ukrainian brigades out of the front line and take them 1,000 miles to the rear to Germany or Poland to train them in this high-level combined arms mass maneuver, I just don't think that's realistic. I don't think the Ukrainian generals can afford to have them out of the line for that long. So I think that the next big step up is not around a capability in terms of a sort of weapon system or whatever else. The next big step up is the arrival of the donor community in Western Ukraine to do that combined arms training. So
British forces there in uniform officially, as opposed to what they're doing now.
Training the Ukrainian army in the rear. Yeah.
I mean, so you could have a British base that could be attacked by Russia. The potential for escalation, for disaster is terrible.
And that's been the case all the way through. I think, hindsight is an amazing thing. And when the history of all of this is written, an analysis will be that we could have gone a lot further, a lot quicker, and that might have stopped the war in its tracks. But it might have also started World War III. The sort of when some colleagues in the House were calling for a no-fly zone, and that to have a no-fly zone, you have to be willing to enforce it, which means that if a Russian jet had flown into the no-fly zone, NATO would have shot it down. Well, that would have started a war between NATO and Russia. So we've been involved in this constant calibration. I think Putin has been surprised by the West's ability to call his bluff and to give stuff that he would have thought unthinkable. And My sense is that he's priced in that the West will be in Western Ukraine. I also think it represents a bit of another step towards his strategic defeat. If the whole point of being in Ukraine in the first place was that it was drifting towards the NATO/Western sphere, the arrival of the Western donor community in Western Ukraine to train Ukrainian brigades kind of takes you one step nearer to Putin's strategic defeat.
Could you imagine a Prime Minister Starmer, for the sake of argument?
I do. I would love to imagine. I dream of a Prime Minister
British
Starmer.
boots on the ground in Ukraine to train Ukrainian forces only at this stage.
I think the one benefit that James has had that I haven't had, and neither has Keir, is that he has seen intelligence briefings within the last month that I would not have seen. And he would have been party to conversations that, as the opposition, we haven't been party to. So I was fascinated to hear you talk about how we would put British troops on the ground. I think we've been very clear, we have backed every effort that the government have made about Ukraine. We stand shoulder to shoulder in every commitment.
Yeah. But if there was a change of Prime Minister later in the year, imagine that as after you've written your letter of last resort to your nuclear submarines, which is a pretty sobering thing to have to do in minute one of being a PM, to then be faced with the decision to put UK troops on the ground, and then to have a really clear view that if that British base were attacked, you wouldn't invoke Article 5 of the NATO treaty because it was a decision that the UK and other like-minded donor countries had taken. And I think that would be a really big condition of other NATO countries. That's an enormous decision. But if you accept that a stalemate or a Ukrainian defeat are catastrophic for Euro-Atlantic security and will require defence spending to return to 5% because you're back into a Cold War, your kind of only option is to pursue the strategy that could deliver Ukrainian victory.
But how different is it to what we're doing at the moment? Because there are British people in Ukraine, whether they're in uniform or not, or whether they're officially on the payroll or not.
A base is a really different thing.
So how different is a base with, and it being official to what is already going on in terms of training?
I mean, at the moment, we've got medics and a diplomatic mission.
It's a bit more than that.
We're in an order of magnitude different. Medics are not a legitimate target for nor are the diplomatic mission. The risk that we would accept in putting troops into Western Ukraine to train Ukrainian army is enormous. It would rely, Putin would have to believe that the response would be enormous if he were to attack us, and he will do his best to deter us from doing so. But the reality is that for the Russian force, for the Ukrainian force, the race is around who can successfully develop a force capable of going on the offensive soonest.
Paul, I mean, what's your understanding of what? I mean, obviously, James, as a minister, until recently, James is in a difficult position in terms of talking about what's actually been going on the ground. But I mean, I know I've met Brits going out to Ukraine. You must have done as well.
For you,
what is understood to have been going on?
I understand that there are some Brits out there in very strategic situations, unofficially, and are very important to the Ukrainian mission. James?
If I knew one way or the other, why would I ever say so and put their lives at risk for the benefit of your listeners? I mean, I can't tell you whether there are or there aren't, but even if I did know, it would be a really stupid thing to do to compromise their security.
It's an odd situation for the British people, though, isn't it? To know that there are, there's some sort of British presence going on in Ukraine, which is not official and is not talked about.
I think that's about national security and defence, and that's the trust and the right we have to operate with the British people. We have to take a lot of this on trust.
All right, well,
and then the general public have to do that with us too.
Let's move away from the shadows and talk about...
Can I ask a question? Where do you see that mission creep ending? Because I'm guessing 2 years ago, the idea of having British boots on the ground would have been, oh God, stay away from that. Yeah. That's going to invoke World War III. And now 2 years in, you're going, all right, well, actually, maybe we do need boots on the ground.
Every single step.
So in 2 years' time, could you see a more engaged role with British troops?
Maybe. I mean, and there's two answers to that. But when I went to Kyiv 2 weeks before the war to tell the then defense minister, and I went with our director of special forces, and I was telling them we were going to give them 6,500. NLAW, Director of Special Forces, was basically talking about supplies of plastic explosives and radio systems that could sort of probably get through Russian electronic warfare. It was equipping a resistance for the invasion. But even then, Ben Wallace ending up putting me on a plane to go and do that, pretty much despite the advice of the National Security Advisor of the day, because that was regarded as us becoming party to the conflict. And that's exactly how the Kremlin tried to interpret it. And every decision thereafter, whether it was Javelin or Starstreak or artillery rounds, the Challenger 2 tanks, all the way up to Storm Shadow most recently, has brought with it a very tense conversation within Whitehall, necessarily between those who are worried that it was an escalation too far that would demand a Russian response versus those who thought it was important to keep Putin on the back foot. Now, that creative tension in government, particularly when the stakes are that high, is very welcome. But of course, people like me, knuckle-headed ex-soldier defense ministers, are going to want to keep up in the ante. And people who have spent their whole career studying geopolitics, as diplomats or securocrats, are going to want to challenge around the sort of intellectual, sense in what's being argued. That's just good government. And I think when the history is written, people can say we should have done more sooner. Actually, when the minutes of Cobras and National Security Councils are declassified, I think people will see some really sound consideration, intelligence-led consideration of what the risks were, but an overarching principle that we needed to continue to confound Putin, rally a donor community through our willingness to go through thresholds first. We've never been the biggest donor in terms of mass, but we've again and again and again been the first to show that we can do something. My sense is that boots on the ground in Ukraine as trainers will be the next thing that we show we can do first, right, and others will follow.
Well, this takes us to, what the British Armed Forces are for, theoretically, in the future, and how you need to plan for potential missions. And we don't, you don't need to have this conversation in terms of what you think is going to happen, but what you think British forces need to be prepared for. Are we back in a world in which we think British Armed Forces could seriously be fighting a ground war against Russia in Europe? Is that what we need to equip our armed forces to be doing?
I think we need to be, I don't want to be alarmist, and we need to be very careful and considered when we're talking about this. I hope that never in my lifetime will we see that. But
is that what you plan for?
But I think you have to prepare for, to counter the operational effectiveness of some of our key opponents or challenger states or adversaries.
Rishi Sunak is saying Putin wouldn't stop at the Polish border. Do you think that's broadly right?
But I think we've already seen that. You saw the president of Georgia 10 days ago talking about hybrid warfare and cyber warfare targeting her nation. So the idea that Russia is just sitting there and isn't an active participant is just nonsense.
But it seems to me
Chris, he already hasn't stopped. Within the last 7 years, there's been a state-sponsored assassination using a chemical weapon on UK soil. So the idea that Putin respects the sovereignty of his neighbours, respects the sovereignty of NATO members, is clearly not true. We've seen a number of state-on-state outrages over the last 10 years that were unimaginable. In fact, over the last 4 years that were unimaginable 5 years ago. So it is eminently possible. And the key answer to your question is, do we need a set of armed forces that could fight Russia in a land war? Yes. And the reason is that the whole point of deterrence is the belief that you would press the nuclear button if you needed to. It's the belief that you would deploy your armed forces into the field and fight with them as part of NATO in order to defeat your principal adversary, which is inescapably Russia right now. It's the maxim that everybody loves to use, but if you want peace, prepare for war. And that is what I think the Prime Minister was trying to do in his rallying cry yesterday. There is a mindset that the British public need to adjust to. Your children are as alarmed as as mine are, they haven't grown up with that reality.
Yeah.
It is quite probable that in their lifetimes, there will be an even greater moment of geopolitical crisis in the Euro-Atlantic. And the way that we keep that below the threshold of armed conflict is by NATO being so overwhelmingly superior that Russia never resorts to military force. But it's bloody expensive to achieve that deterrence.
So it is the madness of keeping an armed forces that you don't want to use. You're keeping it equipped because you think that is the way to ensure it is never used.
Perfection.
Because it's a deterrent.
Is that £75 billion more is spent on defence by the end of the decade, 10 billion of which is on stockpiles, and that not one of those missiles or artillery rounds ever gets fired in anger.
But if you think that this is actually a serious scenario that could happen, and you say, our kids' generation will almost certainly face a scenario more acute than the one we're in.
Again, we're not doing wonders for my 11-year-old stress levels.
That's right. We have not prepared the British public for this at all, have we? I mean, this conversation is not
literally
really
doing it right now. I mean, because it has to start somewhere, right? I mean, at some point, the geopolitical situation requires that the public discourse starts to reflect on these possibilities. And I think that this is pretty timely.
But in terms of affecting, people, our kids, the young generation, if you're talking seriously about a scenario in which we could be in an armed conflict, then you would be talking about conscription. You would be talking about national.
No.
I mean, I think
we didn't do it in the Cold War.
No, but in fairness, what we shouldn't have
the war
seen,
didn't break out. You're talking about a war breaking out, potentially.
Yeah, but we had a military of 250,000 and we had plans for all-out war. And even in those moments, we didn't have a plan for conscription. We have a plan for strategic reserve, which is those who carry a residual liability having served in the armed forces previously. But I think conscription is a red herring.
Conscription is red herring. But what I'm saying is, do you think we actually need to have a much more honest relationship with the British public about how all of that, which still feels quite far away, could affect them directly?
Absolutely.
Which is not just about money.
No, it's not just about money, but it is about impact on their lives. So it isn't just, as we've seen, we saw with Ukraine and the impact on our economy. So we do have to have a genuine conversation with the general public about why defence is important. And honestly, one of the things, and it's something, I think I've been very well behaved and not talked about how small our armed forces are now. But there is an issue here about the fact that our armed forces, there are other consequences to the fact our armed forces are much smaller than they have ever been, or since Napoleon's time. And it's that most people are not exposed to those people that are serving anymore. And that challenges then the right for the general public's understanding and appreciation of what our armed forces are doing for us. And we have to be, there are lots of different reasons why we need to increase the size of our military and for it to be larger than it's been since Napoleon. But one of them also is about the right to operate, and that the general public having an understanding about the world in which we live.
But what you're talking about there, and growing the size of the armed forces, that's going to take a lot more money than just 2.5% of GDP. What you're talking about there, to get preparation scare the bejesus out of Russia into not tinkering with NATO, growing the armed forces, all the weaponry, all the armory that you need. You're talking billions upon billions there. Are you happy to whack up defence spending to 3%, 3.5%?
Oh, well, my personal view, but look, we'll have to spend. We've been very clear as a party. We'll have to spend what needs to be spent to keep this country safe. There is no more important responsibility of a government than to keep its citizens safe.
James wants 3% of GDP. Are you happy with that?
But as I said, James has seen the books and I haven't, and neither has Rachel Reeves yet. So we have exactly the same aspiration as the government in terms of how much we want to spend. But part of this is what we need when we need it, and how we're going to deploy it, and also how we're going to use money well. The problem is that the MOD has not been a very good procurer and has arguably wasted £15 billion since we left office.
Let's just briefly talk about, the politics of this, because this is the context we're in, as to whether this will be any kind of political doorstep issue. James, where do you see, is Rishi Sunak kind of using this at the moment is he using it to sort of please Tory MPs who are a bit annoyed about the budget, or is he using it to appeal to voters?
No, I think he's using it because 2 Saturdays ago, a war could have broken out in the Middle East really easily. And if the war had broken out in the Middle East the contagion would have been rapid, the UK interest would have been directly challenged, and it's impossible to imagine that the UK, Europe, other European actors, the US, would not have ended up being involved. So the combustibility of the geostrategic situation demands that you can't sit in all those G7 and G20 meetings and go, that was an interesting meeting, back to the doorstep. You've got to react. I was disappointed the money wasn't in the budget in the first place, but it's come now.
Part of the reason why you quit?
No, I left government. I mean, fair to the Prime Minister, he said I could stay on till the end of the Parliament. But once you've decided you're not wanting to be an MP for the next 5 years, and you have to kind of decide to be an MP in chunks of 5 years, you can't just do it for another year. I then figured that it was probably right to step back from government and give myself some time to enjoy being a backbench MP and think about what's next. But that didn't mean I wasn't pretty annoyed when I heard the Treasury's solution to defence spending for the budget. It doesn't mean that I didn't grab the microphone at the first opportunity when I left government in order to make the case. And it doesn't mean that I am not very pleased indeed at the announcement that's come.
What do you think the politics of this are?
There shouldn't actually be any. There shouldn't be any politics between the official opposition and the government on matters of national security. This shouldn't be party political. This shouldn't be doorstep. This is about how we protect the country.
On this podcast, we also discuss what the politicians aren't really saying. And one thing senior politicians seem to be avoiding is the real possibility of another Donald Trump presidency and what that means for European defence. I mean, Paul, it's quite clear Donald Trump is not a huge fan of Ukraine and policy would change.
And I think some would argue that he may be a touch of a fan of Vladimir Putin. On the contrary, so this isn't something that politicians are talking about. In part because they've just got so much that they're trying, things that they're trying to deal with at the moment, like keeping their own jobs. That Donald Trump isn't high up on their list of priorities for an awful lot of them. Not like James, of course, but for an awful lot of them. So it's not taking a lot of his face. It is though. In military circles, it is though in defence circles and strategy circles. And there was a big, wide conversation going about what does Donald Trump mean for NATO? What does it mean for the war in Ukraine? The noises that he's made are very non-committal. We've just seen, the votes going through in Senate and Congress. We saw the dividing lines right through the Republican Party when it came to Ukraine. It wasn't easy to get the $60 billion signed off for Ukraine. How easy is that going to be when Donald Trump is actually in the White House? Not easy at all.
And we get a sense of what he wants as a Ukraine compromise from a piece in the Washington Post quite recently, which said he's essentially going to say to Ukraine, you give Russia Crimea and you let them take Donbass in the east, or at least a proportion of what they've already occupied in the course of this war. That's your compromise, end the war that way.
Yeah, it turns out a bloke who wrote a book called The Art of the Deal and then didn't stop banging on about a book called The Art of the Deal wants a deal to be made and him to walk away and not have to spend any more money. Is the long and the short of it. Have I got that right?
Look, it would be madness if that's what Trump thinks is the end state, because it would ignore that between that hasn't all gone in one go. Crimea was taken. And then effectively Putin was appeased through the Minsk agreement and that process. And then Putin came again. And if he's rewarded for his second bite with the 4 oblasts that he claims are now part of sovereign Russia, then in 8 years' time he'll come again and he'll keep coming. And the outrage so that creates a chronic challenge to Euro-Atlantic security. I think there's an awful lot of people around Trump, sensible people around Trump, who can see that no matter how hard America tries to pretend otherwise, it is still an Atlantic power. It has an eastern seaboard, and the security of the Euro-Atlantic therefore impacts on American prosperity, American security. And I think there's an element of the show in this for Trump, that he's trying to leverage European defense spending, leverage a wider commitment from the donor community. I don't think when it comes to it, Trump actually believes that America can just pull up the drawbridge on Europe.
But maybe not pull up the drawbridge, but we're in a scenario, potentially, if Trump wins, where you've got Trump in Washington, Orban in Europe, all pushing for a deal, and Europe starts to argue, doesn't it, over how whether it should end the war, whether it should go the American way.
But it goes back to what we were exploring earlier on, that if the deal were the territorial compromise that you suspected it could be, then is NATO going to guarantee the rest of Ukraine? That feels like the what's different from Minsk. Well, if that's the case, then that's a NATO presence in the rest of Ukraine that needs to be resourced. And what you've got then is East and West Germany playing out either side of the Dnieper. And that's a really expensive situation for the US and the rest of Europe to be involved in. So no matter which way you look at it, when you think about it on the sort of grand strategic whole of the globe as the battle space, it's impossible for the American national security community to think that they can ever turn exclusively to China and never have to worry about Russia and Europe.
Trump may or may not be president, but the relationship between MOD and the Pentagon will continue, between the State Department and FCDO continue. This is not just one man to one man having these conversations. Our relationships with America are at every level of our national security and our intelligence services. So there is a lot more in play.
You're talking about it as if they're equal partnerships. It's not. David Cameron was open about that when he was Prime Minister. He talked about us as the junior partner. In general, we do what the Americans want. But
we work very, very closely with them. But you're also assuming that everyone at the Pentagon thinks that a Trump solution would be a really good idea. And I'm not sure that that's
they wouldn't, but he will be the boss if he wins.
He will be the boss. But I think one of the things that Paul raised was the vote this week. The fact that we finally got to the vote in the US this week for aid in itself is extraordinary and shows that the American leadership of the Republican Party has also shifted position. So this is
not
a
because Trump let it happen. But Trump let that vote go through. That's why it happened.
Yeah, so that's exactly your own point. Trump just let that vote go through to
people like Marjorie
through the premise
Taylor
of what we
Greene were
want.
left out on a limb in the end.
Absolutely, yes, as she should be. But sorry, I think that's my personal view for the record. Before I get myself in lots of trouble. But there is part of that. Trump let it happen because we can't just assume that what Trump is saying in an election contest when he's got many other challenges is the same as what he'll do when he's president.
It's really interesting that you're both kind of working on the basis of he surely couldn't possibly do what he says he's going to do. And that's what your position is based on. Isn't
that what you assume of politicians every time you hear us say anything?
So we'll face it when he does it at the time, I guess. As usual, let's finish with the long-range forecast. How is this week's big story likely to affect the general election? The general election campaign, if this comes, is actually probably as and when it comes. If it's about defence, it is going to be about funding and about different priorities. The Labour Party has been very clear on our commitments and where we will invest, and that we're committed to the concept of deterrence and our nuclear deterrent. So this should not be a party political issue, and I will be really disgusted if this is made a party political issue during the general election campaign. James?
I think that this will be the first election in my lifetime when national security defence is a prominent doorstep issue. I think the public are increasingly concerned about the world in which we're living and what that means to the UK interest. I hope, I expect that the two parties will have manifestos that are broadly the same. I think that's a powerful strategic message to send. The politics will come in what is cut or not done to pay for prioritising defence, and I think that will bring some quite difficult debates for both parties and between the parties. But I think it's necessary because I genuinely think that the next 20, 30 years are going to be more threatening to the UK and our interests around the world. And therefore, it's right that we start to reprioritise defence and for the public to be aware of that necessity.
Defence is the issue where everyone is racing to look as if they back our boys more and throw money at it. And part of that for Labour is, of course, that the last guy who was in charge of the Labour Party wasn't so beloved by the defence community and didn't seem to like the defence community.
Or by some of his parliamentary Labour Party.
Or by some of his parliamentary Labour Party who resigned under him.
We didn't like him much either.
But Keir Starmer is trying really hard to look like he backs defence every bit as much as the Conservatives.
Do neither of you fear the public turning around and going, I can't get an appointment, my services are a mess, why are you telling me I've got to pay for defence spending for an army even you are telling me will never have to do its job and go and fight Russia?
I'd like everything to be perfect and all public service to be brilliantly funded. But in politics, that's never the case. There's always choice. And the simple reality is that the first priority of any government, irrespective of their political persuasion, is the defence and security of the realm. And when the threats around you that you can't control are what they are, government has to look the public in the eye and say, I'm going to make those difficult choices and I'm going to prioritise our defence and security over, sadly, your public services.
Ruth?
The issues on the doorstep are broken public services and access to trying to get a dentist, to being able to pay your bills and the cost of living crisis. And I think we need to remember that those are people's genuine priorities. But what it means for defence, I never, ever have had a conversation on the doorstep that people saying we shouldn't spend money on defence, because they see that as a given. They also see solid public services as a given.
We will leave it there. That was this week's Political Forecast. Until next time, bye-bye.